Imagine a vast desert at dusk. The horizon glows in deep gold and crimson, and the wind carries whispers of ancient voices. In the distance, caravans move slowly across the sand, their footsteps echoing the journeys of countless generations. From the banks of the Nile to the streets of Jerusalem, from the crowded ghettos of Europe to the bustling avenues of New York, the story of the Jewish people stretches across millennia. A story of faith, exile, persecution, and survival. Now, as you listen, let the pace of history become the rhythm of rest. Sit back, take a deep breath, and allow yourself to drift into this journey, calm, steady, and timeless. If you enjoy traveling through history with us, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Part 1: Nomads and Settlers: The Birth of Israelite Identity. Long before the idea of the Jews as a people existed, the lands between the Nile and the Euphrates were home to wandering tribes, small villages, and emerging kingdoms. This was the cradle of ancient civilization: Mesopotamia with its cities and ziggurats, Egypt with its mighty pharaohs, and the rugged hills of Canaan where small clans scratched out a living. Out of this patchwork of cultures, languages, and beliefs, a people slowly took shape, the ancestors of what we today call the Jewish people. Archaeology shows that by the late Bronze Age, the land of Canaan was a mosaic of fortified city-states and farming settlements. Life was difficult. Raids, famine, and shifting imperial powers often determined the fate of small communities. The Egyptians controlled much of the region for centuries, but their grip weakened over time. Into this fractured landscape came small groups of Semitic herders and farmers, who brought with them oral traditions, rituals, and a fierce sense of survival. It is within this environment that we place the legendary figure of Abraham. According to tradition, Abraham left Mesopotamia and journeyed westward to the land of Canaan, where he forged a covenant with a single God, a radical notion in a world dominated by polytheism. Whether or not Abraham existed exactly as the texts describe, his story reflects something deeply historical: the emergence of a community that defined itself not by allegiance to many gods or empires, but by loyalty to one God and one set of promises. For centuries, these tribes lived a semi-nomadic life, moving with their flocks, sometimes farming small plots, sometimes trading with nearby cities. They were not yet powerful, nor were they unified. They lived alongside Canaanites, Philistines, and other peoples, often absorbing local customs. Yet their stories, of creation, of journeys, of covenants, gave them a sense of being set apart. These stories were told by firelight, passed down from elders to children, and carried from one generation to the next. Archaeological discoveries suggest that by the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, a distinct group known as Israelites began to appear in the highlands of Canaan. The famous Merneptah stele, an Egyptian inscription from around 1207 BCE, mentions a people called Israel living in the land. This is the earliest known reference to the Israelites outside of their own texts, a small but powerful reminder that history and memory intertwine. The Israelites were not kings or conquerors in these early centuries. They were farmers and shepherds, struggling to survive in a land often threatened by drought and invasion. Yet their identity deepened. Unlike their neighbors, who often merged deities and shrines, the Israelites emphasized one God above all others. Over time, this belief hardened into a cultural backbone that helped them endure when stronger empires swept across their homeland. The traditions that emerged in this period also carried the seeds of later resilience. The stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, though legendary, emphasized endurance, faith during hardship, and the idea that trials were part of a larger destiny. When famine struck, when enemies attacked, when exile loomed, These stories reminded the people of who they were and why they must survive. As centuries passed, small settlements grew into more organized communities. Tribal leaders guided their people, and eventually, the Israelites began to form loose confederations for defense and trade. These early bonds of unity were fragile, but they laid the groundwork for the eventual rise of a kingdom. The Israelites were still a minor people in a world dominated by Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. Yet their ability to remember, adapt, and preserve their traditions allowed them to hold together where others vanished. At this stage, persecution was not yet systematic, but survival was always precarious. Empires rose and fell, often crushing small tribes in their path. For the Israelites, the danger of assimilation was just as real as the danger of conquest. Larger, wealthier cultures could have easily absorbed them, erasing their distinctiveness. And yet, through their unique blend of memory, ritual, and belief, they held on. The earliest laws and customs, later written down in sacred texts, reflected a people trying to remain distinct. Dietary rules, festival cycles, and purity codes all served not only religious purposes but cultural ones. They reminded the Israelites that they were not just another tribe among many. Every meal, every prayer, every harvest ritual reinforced belonging to something greater, even if they were scattered in small, vulnerable communities. In time, their collective memory of hardship became as important as their victories. Unlike other ancient peoples who boasted only of conquests, the Israelites preserved stories of slavery, exile, and struggle. These narratives did not weaken them, they became sources of strength. To tell of hardship was to remember survival. To remember survival was to believe in the future. Thus, by the dawn of the first millennium BCE, the Jewish people, though not yet called by that name, had already begun to shape an identity unlike any other. Small, scattered, vulnerable, yet bound together by story, ritual, and belief, they stood on the threshold of history. Their journey through persecution, triumph, exile, and return was only beginning. This first chapter ends with a people not yet fully formed but unmistakably on the path toward becoming one of the world's most enduring civilizations. From the hills of Canaan to the tents of nomadic herders, they carried within them the seeds of a story that would echo for millennia, a story of survival against overwhelming odds. Part 2: Egypt and the Exodus, from slavery to nationhood. If the early Israelites first took shape as small tribes in the rugged hills of Canaan, then Egypt became the crucible where their identity was hardened through suffering and survival. The memory of bondage in a foreign land, and the journey out of it, would become the defining story of Jewish history, retold at festivals, sung in psalms, and remembered as both trauma and triumph. Whether every detail happened exactly as Scripture describes is not the central question for historians. What matters is that the memory of Egypt, slavery, exodus, covenant, became the backbone of a people who would forever understand themselves through the lens of exile and deliverance. The Nile Valley was one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. Its pharaohs commanded vast armies, constructed monumental temples, and dominated the politics of the Near East for centuries. Egypt's prosperity relied on fertile soil and a disciplined social order, but its grandeur was built on the backs of laborious, conquered peoples, slaves, and marginalized groups. Into this world, according to tradition, came the Israelites. They had arrived as outsiders, migrants seeking refuge from famine. The story of Joseph, sold into slavery and rising to power at Pharaoh's court, captures this dynamic. The Israelites began as guests, tolerated when useful, but became vulnerable as political winds shifted. Over generations, their fortunes worsened. What had once been survival in a time of scarcity turned into bondage. The Israelites were pressed into forced labor, building cities, hauling stone, serving masters. Egyptian records do not mention them by name, but this silence is unsurprising. The voices of the oppressed rarely find space in the monuments of empire. Yet the memory of oppression left a scar so deep that it outlasted kingdoms. The Israelites carried it with them, repeating it to children, embedding it into their identity. We were slaves in Egypt. The figure of Moses stands at the heart of this story. Born, as tradition says, under a decree of death, raised within Pharaoh's household, and later called by a divine voice from a burning bush, Moses became both liberator and lawgiver. Whether we view him as a single historical figure or as a symbol of collective memory, his story embodies what the Exodus meant: resistance against oppression, faith in deliverance, and the courage to walk into the unknown. The plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, the wilderness wandering, these details live more in the realm of sacred narrative than archaeology. Yet their meaning goes beyond miracle. They reflect the deep conviction of a people that tyranny is not the final word. Against the might of Pharaoh, the story insists that even the smallest, most powerless group could walk free. Against the despair of slavery, it declares that suffering is not permanent. This narrative would echo in Jewish memory again and again. Whenever persecution came, the Exodus promised that survival and freedom were possible. The march through the wilderness, too, became symbolic. It was in the desert, the story says, that the Israelites received the law at Sinai. Here, in a barren land with no empire to overshadow them, a new identity crystallized. They were no longer merely tribes, they were a nation bound by covenant. The commandments that followed were more than religious rules. They were a constitution, shaping how the people would live, eat, work, and worship. Every law became a reminder that they were distinct, chosen not in arrogance but in responsibility. They were to remember their suffering in Egypt and ensure that strangers, widows, and the poor would never be neglected among them. Historically, what matters most about the Exodus tradition is how it shaped memory. Archaeology does not show evidence of hundreds of thousands of slaves crossing the desert, but it does show periods of turmoil, collapse of empires, and migrations in the late Bronze Age that align with such memories. It seems likely that small groups of Israelites experienced oppression and escape in ways that grew into a larger narrative. Over time, these memories were fused into one great story, a story that not only explained their past but prepared them for future trials. When the Israelites finally entered the land of Canaan, according to the tradition, they did so as a people forged in hardship. The conquest narratives of Joshua may exaggerate battles and victories, but the underlying reality is that communities emerged in the highlands, gradually asserting themselves. Their difference was not primarily military might but memory and law. Unlike neighboring tribes, they carried a national story of slavery and liberation, of covenant and law, that shaped their self-understanding. From this point forward, the Exodus became more than history. It became the pattern of Jewish experience. Again and again, Jews would be oppressed, scattered, and despised. Again and again, they would remember Egypt and Exodus. In medieval ghettos, in Spanish exile, in shtetls under Tsarist pogroms, even in Nazi camps, the words of Exodus, "Let my people go," resonated. This was not a story frozen in the past. It was a living reminder that survival was possible, that freedom was promised, that endurance would bring deliverance. Persecution, for the Israelites, was not an accident of history but part of a cycle they had already seen. Egypt taught them that power could turn against them suddenly, that hospitality could sour into enslavement, that they must remain distinct yet resilient. It also taught them that identity could be preserved not by armies or wealth but by memory. Empires rise and fall, but memory can be carried in stories, prayers, and rituals. Thus, the Exodus was not merely the tale of leaving Egypt. It was the beginning of a worldview in which suffering and hope, exile and return, despair and faith are always bound together. It became the rhythm of Jewish history, to endure the night because dawn would come, to remember slavery so that freedom could be cherished, to tell the story again so that no child would forget who they were. By the time the Israelites began to establish themselves in Canaan, they were no longer just a collection of tribes. They were a people of memory, a nation forged in the crucible of Egypt, carrying a story that would sustain them across millennia. Their trials were far from over, but their survival already seemed extraordinary. Against the vast power of Egypt, the Israelites endured, and in that endurance lay the seed of all that would follow. Part 3: Kings and Temples. Israel's Golden Age. By the time the Israelites had settled more firmly in Canaan, their scattered tribal confederations faced constant threats. The land was contested, squeezed between the ambitions of larger empires. Philistine raiders pressed from the coastal plains, while the highland clans fought among themselves. For centuries, Israel's unity was fragile. Yet in moments of crisis, leaders rose, judges, as tradition called them, who rallied the tribes for defense. Still, this system was unstable. The Israelites lacked the centralized power of their neighbors, and without unity, survival remained precarious. It was in this turbulent environment that the people demanded a king. The first chosen was Saul, a warrior who brought some measure of stability but whose reign ended in conflict and decline. His successor, David, proved far more successful. David was both soldier and poet, a man of battlefield cunning and deep charisma. From his base in Hebron, he consolidated the tribes, defeated enemies, and captured Jerusalem, making it his capital. Jerusalem, a neutral city not tied to any single tribe, became the heart of the kingdom. For the first time, Israel was more than a loose collection of clans. It was a nation with a throne, an army, and a vision of permanence. David's reign also embodied the tension that would define Jewish history, the balance between vulnerability and power, faith and politics. On the one hand, he expanded Israel's territory, secured borders, and built alliances. On the other, he faced internal strife, rebellions, and moral failings that reminded his people that no king, however great, could stand without divine favor. His Psalms, whether written by him or attributed later, captured this duality. Songs of triumph mingled with cries of despair, victory entwined with persecution. David's son Solomon inherited the throne and ushered in what tradition remembers as a golden age. Wealth flowed into Jerusalem from trade routes, alliances, and tribute. The city bustled with merchants, scribes, artisans, and priests. At its center rose the first temple, a monumental structure that became the focal point of Israelite worship. Built with cedar from Lebanon and adorned with gold, it was a symbol of permanence and identity. Here the Ark of the Covenant was placed, and here the rituals of sacrifice and prayer tied heaven to earth. For the Israelites, the temple was more than architecture. It was proof that their God had chosen them, dwelled among them, and bound them together as a nation. Festivals brought thousands of pilgrims into the city. Priests codified rituals. Prophets warned against arrogance and corruption, but the sense of pride was undeniable. From small, scattered tribes, Israel had become a kingdom with a capital, a temple, and international recognition. And yet, beneath this grandeur lay fragility. Solomon's wealth depended on heavy taxation and forced labor, which sowed resentment. His many political marriages to foreign wives symbolized alliances but also raised fears of cultural dilution. When Solomon died, the kingdom fractured. The northern tribes broke away, forming the Kingdom of Israel, while the south, with Jerusalem, became Judah. What had been united now stood divided, and division would invite danger. The northern kingdom, larger and wealthier, soon faced the wrath of Assyria, one of the era's most fearsome empires. In 722 BCE, the Assyrians conquered Israel, scattering its people. These became the so-called lost tribes, absorbed into other cultures, their distinct identity vanishing from history. For Jews later in exile, this event was a haunting reminder of what happens when identity dissolves. Judah, smaller but more cohesive, survived longer. Jerusalem's temple remained a beacon, and its kings, though often weak, leaned heavily on prophetic voices that called for justice and loyalty to their God. Still, Judah could not escape the tides of history. When the Babylonians rose to power, they crushed Jerusalem in 586 BCE, tore down the temple, and carried its elite into exile. For the first time, the people who had believed themselves chosen faced the unthinkable, the destruction of their sacred center. Persecution took on a new dimension here. It was not only enslavement or discrimination, as in Egypt, but cultural annihilation. The loss of the temple struck at the heart of identity. To be without land, without king, without altar, could they still be a people? For many nations of the ancient world, such disasters meant disappearance. Yet for the Jews, memory again became survival. In exile, they began to collect, write, and preserve their traditions more intensely. The stories of Abraham, Moses, and David were retold with new urgency, now not just as history but as anchors of identity in foreign soil. The age of kings and temples, then, was both triumph and tragedy. It gave the Jewish people a sense of nationhood, a glorious memory of strength, and the central symbol of the temple. But it also introduced the recurring theme of destruction and exile. Even at their height, they learned how fragile power can be, how quickly empires fall, how dangerous division is. The persecutions of later centuries, during the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Black Death, or the Holocaust, would echo these ancient patterns. Oppression always threatened not only life but memory, not only bodies but identity. And yet, just as in Babylon, the Jewish people found ways to endure. They turned loss into tradition, defeat into resilience, and memory into strength. Thus, the golden age of Israel was golden in memory, but shadowed by loss. From Saul to David to Solomon, from unity to division to exile, the Jews experienced both glory and fragility. They had seen what it meant to rule, but they had also seen what it meant to lose everything. These twin experiences would shape their identity for centuries to come. The temple that once stood in Jerusalem became more than a building. It became a symbol of hope, of longing, of return. Even when it lay in ruins, even when Jews were scattered across continents, they would face Jerusalem in prayer, remembering the time when their people had walked in strength. The Golden Age ended, but its memory endured, not as nostalgia, but as a promise that even in the darkest exile, identity could survive. Part 4: Exile and Return. The Babylonian Captivity. The fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE was one of the most shattering events in Jewish history. For generations, the Israelites had believed their God dwelled among them in the temple. They had celebrated festivals on its steps, brought sacrifices to its priests, and taken pride in their capital city. The temple was more than stone. It was identity, permanence, and proof of divine favor. When the Babylonian armies tore it down, burned its courts, and carried its sacred vessels away, the loss seemed unbearable. The Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar were relentless conquerors. Their empire stretched across Mesopotamia, swallowing smaller kingdoms in its path. Judah had resisted too long, caught between Babylonian and Egyptian power struggles. When rebellion broke out in Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar responded with fury. The city's walls were breached, leaders executed, and its people marched into exile. For those taken to Babylon, The trauma was profound. They had lost their land, their temple, their monarchy, everything that had once defined them. In ancient times, when nations were conquered, their gods were often believed to be conquered as well. For Judah, this posed a painful question. If their God allowed the temple to fall, had he abandoned them? Was their covenant broken? And yet, from this crisis emerged one of the most remarkable transformations in religious history. The Jews did not dissolve into Babylonian culture. Instead, they adapted. Without a temple, sacrifice was impossible, but prayer and study became central. Priests and scribes began compiling traditions, laws, and stories into written form. Oral histories, the sagas of Abraham, the Exodus, the Kings, were preserved with new urgency. Exile, rather than erasing memory, sharpened it. In Babylon, Jewish identity became portable. It was no longer tied only to a building or a king, but could live in text, ritual, and community. Families gathered to remember festivals, not with great pilgrimages to Jerusalem, but in their homes, with prayers and symbolic meals. Leaders like the prophet Ezekiel offered visions of restoration, insisting that exile was not the end but a trial. The psalmist's cry captures the grief and resilience of this period. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Exile was also a lesson in persecution. Though not enslaved in chains, the Jews lived as captives, second class within Babylonian society. Their land was gone, their autonomy stripped away. They were tolerated but powerless, a reminder that survival depended not on military strength but on memory and solidarity. This pattern, living as a minority under greater powers, would repeat again and again throughout history. After several decades, history shifted. In 539 BCE, the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon. Unlike the Babylonians, Cyrus pursued a policy of tolerance. He allowed exiled peoples to return to their homelands and restore their temples. For the Jews, this was nothing short of miraculous. Groups of exiles journeyed back to Jerusalem, rebuilt the altar, and began work on a new temple. The Second Temple, completed in 516 BCE, became the heart of Jewish life once again. Yet not all returned. Many Jews remained in Babylon, where thriving communities developed. This was the beginning of a true diaspora, Jewish life flourishing outside the land of Israel. From this point forward, Jewish history would always be dual, rooted in Jerusalem, but also spread across the world. The Babylonian exile created not only trauma but adaptation. It taught Jews how to survive displacement, how to preserve culture without sovereignty, and how to make memory stronger than geography. The return also brought new challenges. Those who rebuilt Jerusalem found a city in ruins and neighbors who resented their re-establishment. Rebuilding required determination and faith. Prophets like Ezra and Nehemiah insisted on renewing covenant law, teaching Torah, and resisting assimilation. These reforms emphasized the distinctiveness of the Jewish people. Once again, persecution and threat were met not with disappearance but with stronger boundaries of identity. Looking back, the exile and return shaped Jewish memory as deeply as the Exodus. Egypt had been the story of slavery and liberation. Babylon became the story of loss and resilience. Together, they framed the Jewish understanding of history: suffering followed by endurance, exile followed by return, despair followed by renewal. These patterns prepared the Jews for later centuries, when persecution in Europe or catastrophe in the Holocaust would once again threaten their existence. The lesson of Babylon was clear. A people could lose land, power, and temple, yet still remain a people if they carried memory, ritual, and hope. The Jews had seen nations vanish under Babylonian conquest, but they endured. They had been captives, but they emerged with stronger traditions. They had been scattered, but they remained bound together. From this period onward, the Jewish people understood themselves as more than a kingdom. They were a community of memory. Wherever they lived, whether under Persian rule, Greek domination, or Roman occupation, they would remain who they were because their identity lived in their stories, their laws, and their shared suffering. Persecution could wound them, but it could not erase them. The Babylonian captivity thus stands as both tragedy and triumph. It destroyed Jerusalem but gave birth to diaspora resilience. It silenced the temple but elevated text and memory. It brought despair but nurtured hope. From its ashes rose a people who would carry their identity across millennia, through exile after exile, persecution after persecution, yet always remembering Zion. Part 5. Foreign Rule, Greeks, Romans, and Revolt. When the Persians allowed the Jews to return and rebuild their temple, it seemed as though history had turned toward renewal. For nearly 2 centuries, Jerusalem stood as a small but vital center of Jewish life. The Second Temple was less magnificent than Solomon's, but it restored a sense of continuity. Pilgrims once again filled the city for festivals, priests led sacrifices, and prophets spoke of faithfulness. Yet history did not stop. The Jews were never entirely free of empire, and the empires of the classical age would test their endurance in new and painful ways. In the 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great swept across the Near East, defeating the Persians and absorbing their territories. With him came not only armies but culture, Greek language, art, philosophy, and politics. Hellenism became the dominant force from Egypt to India. For Jews, this new order was both opportunity and threat. Greek became the language of trade and learning, and many Jews, especially those in Alexandria, embraced it. The Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, creating the famous Septuagint, which made Jewish texts accessible to the wider world. Yet assimilation carried risks. Traditionalists worried that Greek theater, philosophy, and religion would erode Jewish distinctiveness. The tension erupted dramatically under the Seleucid dynasty, one of the Greek kingdoms that controlled Judea. In the 2nd century BCE, King Antiochus IV tried to impose Hellenistic religion in Jerusalem, even desecrating the temple by dedicating it to Zeus. For the Jews, this was not merely political domination, it was an assault on their identity. Resistance flared, led by a priestly family known as the Maccabees. Against overwhelming odds, they launched a revolt, reclaimed Jerusalem, and rededicated the temple. This victory is still remembered in the festival of Hanukkah, a celebration of resilience against forced assimilation. For a brief moment, the Jews enjoyed independence under the Hasmonean dynasty. Yet internal divisions, between traditionalists and Hellenizers, between priestly elites and ordinary people, weakened the kingdom. As so often in their history, unity proved fragile, and division opened the door to outside control. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, Rome had arrived. The Romans, heirs of empire, brought both order and brutality. They recognized the strategic value of Judea as a land bridge between Egypt and Syria. To maintain control, they placed local rulers, such as Herod the Great, on the throne. Herod rebuilt the temple on a grand scale, making it one of the wonders of the ancient world. Its massive retaining walls, still visible today, testified to ambition and wealth. Yet Herod's reign was also marked by suspicion and cruelty. His loyalty to Rome and his heavy-handed rule made him deeply unpopular. Roman governance of Judea grew harsher over time. Taxes were heavy, governors corrupt, and soldiers contemptuous of Jewish customs. Tensions boiled over in 66 CE, when rebellion erupted in Jerusalem. Zealots, convinced that God would deliver them, rose against Rome. For a few years, the rebels managed to hold the city. But Rome responded with overwhelming force. In 70 CE, the legions under Titus stormed Jerusalem, destroyed the Second Temple, and carried off its treasures in triumph. The Arch of Titus in Rome still depicts soldiers parading the temple menorah as spoils of war. The destruction of the Second Temple was a catastrophe beyond words. Once again, the sacred center of Jewish life was reduced to ashes. Survivors were slaughtered, enslaved, or scattered. For Jews, it was another trauma to add to the long chain of persecutions. The loss of the temple forced yet another adaptation. Sacrifice was no longer possible. Priestly authority collapsed. But out of this destruction, a new form of Judaism arose, one centered on synagogues, study, and rabbinic teaching. What seemed like an ending became, in time, a transformation. The Romans were not finished. In 132 CE, another rebellion flared, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, hailed by some as a messianic figure. For a brief period, the rebels drove out Roman forces and restored control over Jerusalem. But the might of Rome was relentless. By 135 CE, the revolt was crushed, Jerusalem was leveled, and Jews were banned from the city. The land was renamed Palestina, in an attempt to erase Jewish identity from it altogether. This was persecution at its most brutal: expulsion, cultural erasure, and the scattering of a people. The Romans sought to extinguish Jewish presence in their homeland, just as later persecutors in medieval Europe would seek to erase them from towns, kingdoms, or professions. Yet, once again, memory survived. Synagogues became centers of community across the diaspora. Rabbis preserved laws and traditions in the Mishnah and, later, the Talmud. The longing for Zion, for Jerusalem, became embedded in daily prayers. The pattern was now unmistakable. Empire after empire had risen against the Jews. Each tried to dominate, assimilate, or erase them. Yet each time, the Jews adapted, remembered, and endured. Egyptian slavery, Babylonian exile, Greek assimilation, Roman destruction, all had failed to annihilate them. Instead, each catastrophe gave birth to new forms of survival. The destruction of the Second Temple marked the beginning of a truly global diaspora. From Judea, Jews spread across the Mediterranean, settling in communities from North Africa to Spain, from Babylon to Rome. In each new land, they carried with them stories of exodus, exile, revolt, and persecution. Each new generation inherited not only rituals but also memories of survival. For centuries to come, Jewish life would be lived not as sovereign rulers in their land, but as minorities under foreign powers. This status made them vulnerable to discrimination and violence. In medieval Europe, they would be confined to ghettos and accused of terrible crimes. During the Black Death, they would be blamed for plague and massacred in pogroms. Under Nazism, they would be marked for extermination. The roots of these persecutions stretched back to these early centuries, when Jews had already learned what it meant to live without power in a world ruled by empires. The Greeks and Romans left deep scars. Yet they also left lessons: that survival does not depend on temples or thrones, but on memory, law, and community. These were the tools that would carry Jews through centuries of persecution. Even when their sacred city was destroyed, even when they were banned from entering it, they never forgot Jerusalem. They prayed facing it, wept for it, and dreamed of return. Thus, under foreign rule, in revolt, and in defeat, the Jews again redefined themselves. They were no longer simply a nation in one land. They were a people bound by memory, able to live anywhere, able to survive anything. The era of kings and temples had ended. the era of diaspora had begun. Part 6. A People Scattered, Early Diaspora. The destruction of Jerusalem and the banning of Jews from their own city by the Romans marked not only the end of Jewish sovereignty in antiquity, but also the beginning of a new chapter, life as a dispersed people. Scattered across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and Mesopotamia, Jews entered an era in which their identity would no longer be tied to political power or territory. Instead, it would survive through memory, ritual, and community. The centuries that followed were a testing ground for this transformation, filled with both opportunity and persecution. In the Roman world, Jewish communities soon appeared in many cities. In Alexandria, they had already flourished since the days of the Ptolemies. In Rome itself, Jewish merchants, artisans, and freed slaves established synagogues. In Asia Minor, North Africa, and even along the Rhine, small but vibrant groups took root. These early diaspora communities lived side by side with larger populations, trading in markets, contributing as physicians and scholars, and practicing their faith in relative quiet. But dispersion also carried dangers. Without the protection of a homeland, Jews depended on the tolerance of host societies. Sometimes they were accepted as useful traders or advisors. At other times, they were treated with suspicion, singled out as aliens, and subjected to hostility. Their refusal to abandon distinct customs, circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath observance, set them apart from their neighbors. What for Jews was survival and faithfulness, for outsiders was often viewed as stubbornness or defiance. The rise of Christianity deepened these tensions. In the first centuries of the Common Era, Christianity emerged from Jewish roots, but quickly diverged and began to define itself in contrast to Judaism. As the new faith spread across the empire and eventually became Rome's official religion, Jews found themselves increasingly marginalized. Early Christian leaders often blamed Jews for rejecting Jesus, and this accusation hardened into centuries of hostility. By the 4th century, when Christianity had imperial backing, Jews were restricted from public office, from building new synagogues, and from exercising certain rights. What had been cultural suspicion became institutionalized discrimination. In the East, under Persian and later Islamic rule, Jewish communities experienced different conditions. In Mesopotamia, Jews preserved learning through the great academies of Sura and Pumbedita, where scholars compiled the Babylonian Talmud, a monumental work of law, commentary, and tradition that became the backbone of rabbinic Judaism. Here, even in exile, Jews transformed persecution into scholarship, turning the vulnerability of diaspora into the strength of intellectual life. Under early Islamic rule, Jews were recognized as people of the book, allowed to practice their religion in exchange for a tax. This status, known as dhimmi, placed them below Muslims but offered a degree of protection. In cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, Jewish communities thrived culturally and intellectually, producing poets, physicians, and philosophers. Figures such as Maimonides, born in Spain in the 12th century, stand as proof of Jewish creativity under these conditions. Yet the dhimmi status also reinforced inferiority, ensuring that Jews were marked as separate and vulnerable to shifts in political or religious sentiment. Periods of tolerance could be followed by violence, expulsions, or forced conversions. In Christian Europe, life was harsher. By the early Middle Ages, Jews were often confined to specific trades, moneylending, for example, since Christians were forbidden by church law from charging interest. This economic role made Jews both necessary and resented. Rulers sometimes protected them as valuable financiers, but this same dependence bred suspicion and anger. When debts grew heavy, rulers could cancel them by expelling their Jewish populations, seizing their property in the process. By the time of the Crusades in the 11th and 12th centuries, persecution reached new extremes. Crusading armies, fired by religious zeal, massacred Jewish communities along the Rhine, accusing them of betraying Christ. Entire towns were wiped out in a wave of brutality. Jews fled eastward, seeking refuge in Poland and Lithuania, where rulers initially welcomed them as valuable settlers. Yet even there, centuries later, pogroms would erupt. The pattern of diaspora life was becoming clear. Jews survived by adapting, by clinging to traditions that bound them together in alien lands. But these same traditions marked them as different and often provoked hostility. They were outsiders everywhere, tolerated when convenient, targeted when times turned hard. Their resilience was extraordinary, yet it came at the price of endless vulnerability. Through all this, memory remained central. The destruction of the temple was remembered in prayer, exile was recalled at every Passover meal, Jerusalem was mourned in song. These memories kept identity alive even when persecution tried to crush it. The Jews did not dissolve into their host societies, though assimilation was always a temptation. Instead, they carried with them a sense of peoplehood stronger than borders, more enduring than kingdoms. In this period, we see the roots of later tragedies. The accusations that would surface during the Black Death, that Jews poisoned wells, that they brought plague, had their seeds in these centuries of being marked as outsiders. The restrictions of ghettos, the forced conversions of the Inquisition, the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and even the racial antisemitism of the 20th century, all drew on the image of the Jew as alien, separate, and permanent outsider. Yet we also see the resilience that would carry them through. In every land, Jews built synagogues, taught their children, debated law, and sang ancient songs. They preserved a rhythm of life that persecution could not erase. They were merchants in Spain, scholars in Baghdad, financiers in Italy, craftsmen in Poland. They were despised as different, yet they enriched the cultures around them. Thus, the early diaspora was not simply exile, it was the creation of a new way of being Jewish. Without kings or temples, Jews became a people of memory, text, and community. This adaptation, forged under pressure, would be their shield through centuries of persecution. Scattered though they were, they remained one people, bound not by borders but by shared history and hope. Part 7: Ghettos and Expulsions. Medieval Europe. By the dawn of the Middle Ages, Jewish communities had already taken root across much of Europe. From Spain and France to Germany and Italy, small but significant groups lived alongside Christian majorities. At first, conditions varied widely. Some rulers valued Jews as administrators, traders, and financiers. Others tolerated them reluctantly, viewing them as strangers in a Christian world. But as centuries passed, tolerance gave way to systematic restriction. The medieval period became one of ghettos, expulsions, and an intensification of antisemitism that would echo through the ages. In the early medieval centuries, Jews often served as merchants in long-distance trade networks. Their knowledge of multiple languages and their connections across the Mediterranean made them valuable intermediaries between Christian and Muslim worlds. Spices, silk, and precious metals moved along routes where Jewish traders acted as links between societies otherwise divided by religion. But with this role came suspicion. Their visibility in moneylending and commerce fueled resentment, especially as Christian teaching forbade usury but relied on credit nonetheless. By the 11th century, hostility toward Jews had hardened. Christian theology increasingly portrayed them not only as unbelievers but as enemies of Christ. Accusations that Jews were guilty of deicide, the killing of Jesus, became widespread. This theological charge fueled hatred that went far beyond religious disagreement. Jews were no longer simply a different faith community. They were cast as cosmic villains in the Christian narrative. The Crusades unleashed this hostility with terrifying violence. As knights marched toward Jerusalem in 1096, mobs turned their fury on Jewish communities in the Rhineland. Towns such as Worms, Mainz, and Speyer saw massacres in which entire populations were slaughtered. Chroniclers recorded suicides of families who chose death rather than forced conversion. For Jews, the Crusades were not a distant holy war but an immediate catastrophe. The memory of these pogroms lingered for centuries, a grim reminder that at any moment, neighbors could become executioners. Even when mass killing subsided, discrimination became institutionalized. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Jews were forced into segregated quarters in many European cities. These areas, later called ghettos, were often walled, locked at night, and subject to curfews. Within them, Jews lived crowded lives, cut off from wider society. They could leave only for work or trade, and always at the mercy of local rulers. The ghetto was both a prison and a refuge, a place of constraint, yet also a place where Jewish culture, learning, and ritual could continue under pressure. Expulsions became another recurring feature of medieval Jewish life. England expelled its Jews in 1290 under King Edward I, seizing their property and cancelling debts owed to them. France followed with multiple expulsions throughout the 14th century, each time allowing Jews to return only to be driven out again when convenient. Spain would ultimately follow the same path in 1492, but even earlier, waves of hostility had already set the pattern. For Jews, exile was never final. They always rebuilt elsewhere. But the trauma of uprooting, the loss of homes, synagogues, and livelihoods, was repeated generation after generation. The 13th century also witnessed one of the darkest inventions of medieval anti-Semitism, the blood libel. Beginning in England in 1144, Jews were falsely accused of murdering Christian children to use their blood in rituals. These grotesque fabrications spread rapidly across Europe, sparking pogroms and reinforcing the image of Jews as monstrous outsiders. No matter how baseless the charge, it was repeated again and again, leaving a legacy of paranoia that would persist for centuries. Economic pressures deepened the cycle. Because Jews were restricted from owning land or joining many guilds, they were often pushed into moneylending. This occupation, resented by debtors, fueled stereotypes of Jewish greed. Yet this role was not chosen freely but forced by exclusion. Rulers exploited it when convenient, borrowing heavily from Jewish financiers and then relieving themselves of debt by expelling their creditors. In this way, persecution was woven into the very economic structure of medieval Europe. The Church, too, played a role in enforcing separation. Councils decreed that Jews must wear distinctive clothing, badges, hats, or colors, so they could be identified in public. These laws humiliated and marked Jews as perpetual outsiders. In markets and streets, Jewish difference was visible at a glance, reinforcing prejudice. These outward symbols of exclusion foreshadowed the yellow star of later centuries. Yet even within such hostile conditions, Jewish life endured. Ghettos became centers of learning, where rabbis taught, scribes copied manuscripts, and communities preserved traditions. Festivals were still celebrated, children were still educated, prayers still recited. In Italy, Jewish scholars engaged with classical texts. In Spain, poets and philosophers flourished during brief periods of tolerance. The ability to preserve culture within confinement became one of the remarkable traits of Jewish history. Persecution, however, was never far away. When famine struck, Jews were blamed for hoarding grain. When plague spread, they were accused of poisoning wells. When debts grew heavy, they were expelled. Each calamity reinforced the precariousness of Jewish existence in medieval Europe. To be Jewish was to live at the mercy of forces beyond control, of kings, bishops, mobs, and disease. Still, the very experience of repeated persecution deepened resilience. Jews developed tight-knit communal structures, mutual aid systems, and a determination to endure. They carried with them not only texts and traditions but also the memory of suffering. Just as the Exodus was retold to give hope, so too were the pogroms and expulsions remembered as warnings and as proof of survival. By the end of the medieval period, Jewish life in Europe had been marked by centuries of confinement, accusation, and exile. Yet it had also produced extraordinary cultural richness. The ghettos, meant to silence and isolate, had become laboratories of endurance. Expulsions, meant to erase, had only scattered Jewish communities more widely, ensuring their presence across the continent. The Middle Ages left a legacy that would shape anti-Semitism for centuries to come. The myths of blood libel, the practice of ghettoization, the habit of expulsion, the economic stereotypes, all would resurface in later times, including in the darkest chapter of the 20th century. The persecution of Jews in medieval Europe was not an aberration but part of a pattern, each generation inheriting prejudices from the last. And yet, the Jews endured. Against walls, against exile, against accusation, they carried their memory forward. Medieval Europe sought to confine and control them, but instead, it forged in them the strength of continuity. They remained a people, scattered but unbroken, awaiting a future where the cycle of persecution might finally end. Part 8. Plague and Persecution. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was struck by one of the deadliest catastrophes in recorded history. The Black Death, the bubonic plague carried by fleas and rats, spreading rapidly along trade routes, killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1352. Cities emptied, villages vanished, and fear hung over the continent like a shadow. In a world with little understanding of disease, people sought explanations. And in their desperation, they turned once again against the Jews. The plague arrived first in the ports of Italy, carried on ships from the east. From there, it spread north and west, devastating cities like Florence, Marseille, and Barcelona before reaching the heart of Europe. Symptoms were swift and terrifying: fever, swellings, blackened skin, and death within days. Doctors had no cure. Priests could not stop it with prayers. Governments were powerless. Entire communities were paralyzed by fear. In this atmosphere of panic, long-standing prejudices erupted. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells or deliberately spread the plague to destroy Christians. The accusations were baseless. Jews died from the plague at the same devastating rates as everyone else, but logic had little power against fear. In towns and villages across Germany, Switzerland, and France, mobs turned on Jewish neighbors. Entire communities were massacred. One of the most infamous events occurred in 1349 in Strasbourg. There, hundreds of Jews were burned alive in the town square after being accused of causing the plague. Their possessions were seized, their children forcibly baptized. In Mainz and Cologne, similar atrocities took place, with thousands killed. Chroniclers recorded with chilling detail how mobs, driven by terror and hatred, slaughtered entire populations. For Jews, the plague was not only a disease but also another wave of persecution. Authorities were often complicit. While some rulers attempted to protect Jewish communities, others exploited the hysteria. Debts owed to Jewish moneylenders could be cancelled conveniently through massacre. Properties could be confiscated under the guise of punishment. The cycle of economic envy and religious hatred merged with the panic of plague to unleash violence on a scale rarely seen before. Yet even amid this brutality, patterns of resilience continued. In some regions, Jews fled eastward to Poland and Lithuania, where rulers initially welcomed them as valuable settlers. These lands became new centers of Jewish life, offering relative safety compared to Western Europe. Over time, Eastern Europe would host the largest Jewish populations in the world. But the memory of flight during plague years remained etched into communal identity, proof that safety in one place was never permanent. The Black Death also reinforced the mythology of Jewish otherness. Accusations of well poisoning and ritual murder deepened stereotypes that Jews were dangerous, alien, and plotting against Christian society. These ideas did not fade when the plague ended. Instead, they lingered, passed down in whispers and sermons, ready to resurface whenever society faced new crises. The myth of the Jew as a hidden enemy, born in medieval persecution, would reappear centuries later in the anti-Jewish propaganda of Nazi Germany. For Jews themselves, the plague years deepened their sense of precariousness. The rituals of mourning, already central to Jewish tradition, took on even greater weight. Communities decimated by both disease and violence had to rebuild with what little was left. Rabbis and chroniclers preserved the memory of massacres, weaving them into the long story of exile and persecution. These memories became both a warning and a source of identity, a reminder that survival always came at great cost, but also that endurance was possible even after catastrophe. The plague also revealed the paradox of Jewish existence in medieval Europe. On the one hand, Jews were integral to economic and social life, serving as traders, artisans, and financiers. On the other, they were seen as perpetual outsiders, easily scapegoated in times of crisis. Their very usefulness made them visible, and their visibility made them vulnerable. The Black Death showed how quickly a fragile tolerance could collapse into violence. Beyond Europe, Jewish communities in the Middle East also faced challenges, though persecution there was less directly tied to the plague. Under Islamic rule, Jews lived as minorities with limited rights but often more stability than their European counterparts. Still, outbreaks of violence occurred, and the constant reminder of second-class status shaped Jewish identity in those lands as well. By the time the plague receded, Jewish life in Western Europe had been profoundly altered. Many communities were wiped out entirely. Survivors often fled east, leaving behind empty synagogues and mass graves. The Jewish map of Europe shifted, with Poland and Lithuania becoming new centers while Germany, France, and Spain became lands of recurring danger. The Black Death was a turning point. It revealed how deeply rooted anti-Semitism had become, how quickly it could flare into violence, and how devastating its consequences could be. For Jews, the plague was another chapter in the story that had begun in Egypt, in Babylon, under Rome, the story of being blamed, persecuted, and yet enduring. The pattern was clear. In times of prosperity, Jews might be tolerated. In times of crisis, they were blamed. This cycle would repeat in later centuries, from economic recessions to political upheavals. The memory of the plague years served as a stark reminder that Jewish survival depended not on the goodwill of rulers or neighbors, but on the strength of community, tradition, and memory. Thus, the Black Death was both a disaster and a lesson. It showed the depths of human fear and hatred, but also the resilience of a people who refused to vanish. From the ashes of Strasbourg and the ruins of Mainz, Jewish life continued, carried eastward, carried forward, carried in memory. Persecution had not destroyed them. It had only added another chapter to the long, unbroken story of survival.
Part 9. Between Tolerance and Hatred, Renaissance to Enlightenment. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe was undergoing profound transformation. The Renaissance revived classical learning, art, and science. The Reformation fracturet Christian unity. The age of exploration expanded horizons, bringing new wealth and new questions about humanity.
The Enlightenment promised reason, progress, and human rights.
Yet for Jews, this period was not a simple march toward liberation. It was a time of paradox, moments of opportunity alongside persistent persecution, intellectual flourishing shadowed by ghettos and expulsions. In the Iberian Peninsula, Jewish life had once thrived under both Muslim and Christian rule. Spain in the Middle Ages had produced poets, philosophers, and statesmen of Jewish origin, such as Solomon ibn Gabirol and Judah Halavi. Under Islamic Cordoba, Jews had contributed to medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. But the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Spain, shifted the balance. By the late 15th century, rising religious fervor and pressure for unity made Jewish difference intolerable. In 1492, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering all Jews to convert to Christianity or leave Spain. This decree uprooted one of the largest and most vibrant Jewish communities in the world. Tens of thousands fled, some to Portugal, only to be expelled again a few years later, others to North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, or Italy. Many who converted, known as conversos or new Christians, lived under suspicion, accused by the Inquisition of secretly practicing Judaism. Torture, confiscations, and executions followed. For Jews, Spain became a symbol of betrayal, once a land of flourishing, now a land of exile and fear. Elsewhere in Europe, the situation was little better. In Italy, Jews were confined to ghettos, such as the famous Venetian ghetto established in 1516. Behind locked gates, Jews lived crowded lives, restricted in trade and movement. Yet even within these walls, culture survived. Jewish printers produced Hebrew books, rabbis taught, musicians composed. The ghetto, while a prison, also became a crucible of identity. In Germany and Eastern Europe, restrictions continued. Pogroms flared during the wars of religion and during times of famine or political chaos. In Poland and Lithuania, Jews initially found relative tolerance, becoming integral to the economy as traders and leaseholders of estates. But this security proved fragile. In the mid-17th century, the Cossack uprisings in Ukraine unleashed horrific massacres of Jewish communities. Tens of thousands were killed in pogroms that rivaled the worst violence of earlier centuries. Survivors fled westward, carrying with them trauma and memory. Yet even in this atmosphere of discrimination, Jewish intellectual life blossomed. The Renaissance brought Jewish scholars into contact with classical texts and new scientific discoveries. In Italy, Jewish philosophers engaged with humanism. In Amsterdam, a city of relative tolerance, Jews found refuge after expulsion from Spain and Portugal. There, thinkers like Baruch Spinoza challenged not only Jewish tradition but also Christian dogma, contributing to the intellectual ferment of modern Europe. The Enlightenment of the 18th century promised new possibilities. Philosophers spoke of universal rights, equality before the law, and freedom of conscience. In some places, these ideas led to real change. The French Revolution declared the emancipation of Jews, granting them full citizenship for the first time in modern Europe. Similar reforms spread gradually, breaking down some of the old barriers of ghettos and special taxes. For Jews, this was a moment of hope. After centuries of exile and exclusion, they might finally live as equal citizens. But emancipation brought new challenges. Integration raised fears among some Jews that identity would be lost. For others, it offered unprecedented opportunities. Jews became bankers, doctors, lawyers, writers, and politicians. In Germany, Jewish intellectuals such as Moses Mendelssohn embraced the Enlightenment, seeking to harmonize Jewish tradition with modern philosophy. Mendelssohn's vision of Judaism as a rational, ethical faith resonated with reformers and laid the foundation for modern Jewish movements. Yet even as the Enlightenment opened doors, new forms of anti-Semitism emerged. Old accusations of ritual murder and well poisoning gave way to stereotypes about greed, power, and conspiracy. Emancipation threatened traditional hierarchies, and some opponents of change targeted Jews as symbols of modern disruption.
Pamphlets and Karikatures spriet hostile Images of Jews as Cunning Financiers or Dangerous Radikals.
Hatred, once cloaked in religious language, began to take on a new political and racial form. This dual reality defined the early modern era for Jews: ghettos and pogroms on one side, emancipation and cultural flowering on the other. In cities like Vienna, Berlin, and Paris, Jews contributed to the arts and sciences, while in rural Poland and Russia, they lived in poverty, subject to sudden outbreaks of violence. The contradictions were stark, and they prepared the ground for the turbulent 19th and 20th centuries. The Renaissance and Enlightenment were therefore not a straight line toward freedom. For Jews, they were centuries of transition, from religious to racial persecution, from confinement to partial integration, from despair to hope and back again. The patterns of persecution persisted, but so too did the resilience of memory and tradition. Looking back, the lesson is clear. Even in an age that celebrated reason and human dignity, Jews remained vulnerable to hatred. Tolerance was fragile, easily reversed by fear or fanaticism. And yet, Jewish life adapted again. From the ghettos of Venice to the salons of Berlin, from the massacres of Ukraine to the debates of Paris, Jews continued to survive, contribute, and hope. The Enlightenment planted the seeds of both emancipation and modern anti-Semitism. In the centuries ahead, these seeds would grow, some into the promise of equal citizenship, others into the poisonous ideologies that would culminate in catastrophe. The tension between tolerance and hatred defined the Jewish experience in this era, as it had for centuries, and as it would again in the centuries to come.
Part 10: Emancipation and Backlash. The 19th century was a time of immense change for Europe. Revolutions shook old monarchies, new nations were born, and industry transformed cities and societies. For Jews, this century marked a dramatic turning point. After centuries of ghettos, expulsions, and restrictions, they were offered a chance to step into modern society as equal citizens. The process was uneven, often resisted, and sometimes reversed, but emancipation promised something no Jewish generation in Europe had ever known: legal equality. The first breakthrough came with the French Revolution. In 1791, revolutionary leaders declared that Jews were to be citizens of France, equal before the law. For the first time, Jews could vote, hold office, and live outside segregated quarters. The French model spread as Napoleon's armies carried revolutionary ideals across Europe. In the lands he conquered, ghettos were torn down, discriminatory taxes abolished, and Jews given new freedoms. To many, it seemed that centuries of exile were finally ending. But emancipation was not uniform. In Germany, Austria, and much of Eastern Europe, resistance was strong. Many rulers feared that Jewish equality would threaten Christian social order. In Russia, millions of Jews were confined to the Pale of Settlement, a vast region stretching from Poland to Ukraine, where they lived in crowded shtetls, forbidden from moving freely or entering many professions. While Paris or Berlin might offer Jewish families the promise of integration, life in Eastern Europe often remained mired in poverty and discrimination. Where emancipation did take hold, the results were transformative. Jewish families moved into professions long closed to them: medicine, law, journalism, academia. Jewish bankers and entrepreneurs helped finance railroads, factories, and trade networks that powered the industrial age. In Vienna, Budapest, and Berlin, Jewish artists, writers, and scientists flourished. Figures like Heinrich Heine, the poet, and Felix Mendelssohn, the composer, became cultural icons. Later in the century, Jewish scientists such as Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud would reshape entire fields of knowledge. Yet this very success fueled resentment. As Jews rose in visibility, anti-Semitic voices claimed they were gaining too much influence. Old stereotypes of greed and cunning were repackaged in new language. Anti-Semitism became less about religion, though that never disappeared, and more about race and politics. Jews were portrayed not merely as unbelievers, but as an alien people who could never truly belong, no matter how much they assimilated. The word anti-Semitism itself was coined in this era, in the 1870s, by German nationalist Wilhelm Marr. He argued that Jews were a racial threat to European nations, not simply a religious minority. His writings, and others like them, gave hatred a modern vocabulary. This scientific anti-Semitism claimed to be based on biology and nationalism, not theology. It appealed to audiences who embraced progress but still feared difference. Political movements seized on these ideas. In Austria, the populist mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, built his career on anti-Semitic rhetoric, blaming Jews for economic hardship and cultural decline. In Russia, pogroms, violent mob attacks on Jewish communities, erupted in the 1880s after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Though Jews had no connection to the crime, they were accused of disloyalty, and mobs destroyed homes, shops, and synagogues. The pogroms drove waves of Jewish migration, with millions leaving Eastern Europe for America, where they sought safety and opportunity. Even in countries that granted rights, equality remained fragile. In France, the Dreyfus Affair of the 1890s exposed how deep anti-Semitism still ran. Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish army officer, was falsely accused of treason and convicted on flimsy evidence. The case divided France for years, with anti-Semitic mobs shouting "Death to the Jews" in the streets. Only later, after evidence revealed his innocence, was Dreyfus exonerated. The scandal revealed how quickly Jewish loyalty could be questioned, even in the land of emancipation. Amid this climate, new Jewish responses emerged. Some embraced assimilation, believing that adopting European culture fully would protect them. Others turned inward, strengthening religious traditions to preserve identity. And a growing number embraced Zionism, the idea that Jews could never be safe in diaspora and must return to their ancestral homeland. Theodor Herzl, a journalist covering the Dreyfus Affair, became the father of modern political Zionism. In his book The Jewish State, 1896, he argued that persecution was inevitable and that only a sovereign homeland could secure Jewish survival. His ideas would inspire generations, eventually shaping the creation of Israel in the 20th century. The 19th century was therefore both liberation and warning. Jews were freer than they had ever been in Europe. They contributed to culture, science, and politics at unprecedented levels. They became citizens, parliamentarians, innovators, and leaders. Yet at the same time, hatred adapted. No longer confined to sermons or medieval myths, anti-Semitism modernized. It became racial, political, and nationalistic. It accused Jews not only of rejecting Christ but of undermining nations, manipulating economies, and plotting conspiracies. This dual legacy, emancipation and backlash, prepared the ground for the next century. The hopes of integration and equality would collide with the rise of nationalism and racial ideology. For Jews, the 19th century offered both a glimpse of belonging and a reminder that belonging could always be revoked. They had stepped out of the ghettos, but they had not escaped suspicion. They had entered universities and parliaments, but they had not silenced hatred. The story of Jewish history in this era is not simply one of persecution. It is also one of extraordinary achievement. Out of centuries of confinement came poets, composers, scientists, and thinkers who shaped the modern world. Out of shtetls and ghettos came communities that built new lives in America and beyond. Out of injustice came new movements of self-determination. The 19th century proved that Jewish resilience was not only about survival, but about flourishing even in the shadow of prejudice. And yet, the shadow remained. The new anti-Semitism that emerged in this century would not fade. Instead, it would deepen in the 20th century, combining with nationalism, war, and ideology to unleash the darkest chapter in Jewish history. The promise of emancipation had opened doors, but the backlash of hatred ensured that the struggle for survival was far from over. Part 11. Pogroms and Zionism. By the late 19th century, Jewish life in Europe was split between two very different realities. In Western and Central Europe, Jews were gradually gaining civil rights, entering universities, and contributing to cultural and scientific life. In Eastern Europe, however, millions of Jews lived in poverty and vulnerability, confined by the Russian Empire to the so-called Pale of Settlement, a vast region stretching across modern Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. Here, Jewish communities clustered in small towns and villages, the shtetls, where life revolved around the synagogue, the marketplace, and traditions passed from generation to generation. But in this same land of prayer and poverty, persecution struck with relentless force. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, carried out by revolutionaries with no Jewish involvement, unleashed a storm of violence. Across the Pale, rumors spread that Jews were to blame. Mobs attacked Jewish homes and shops, looting, burning, and killing. These riots, known as pogroms, became a recurring nightmare. In Kiev, Odessa, Kishinev, and dozens of other towns, Jewish blood ran in the streets. Sometimes local authorities looked the other way. Sometimes they actively encouraged the violence. For Jewish families, safety felt impossible. The pogroms of the 1880s and 1900s left tens of thousands dead and even more traumatized. Survivors carried with them memories of shattered synagogues and murdered relatives. Whole communities uprooted themselves, fleeing in search of safety. Between 1881 and 1914, more than 2 million Jews left Eastern Europe, the largest migration in Jewish history since antiquity. Most went to the United States, where they settled in cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Others went to Argentina, South Africa, or Western Europe. These migrations reshaped Jewish life worldwide, turning the United States into a new center of Jewish culture. Life in America offered both freedom and struggle. Immigrants crowded into tenements on New York's Lower East Side, working long hours in garment factories or as street peddlers. Poverty was severe, but persecution was absent. Unlike Europe, America offered citizenship, opportunity, and the promise that children could rise beyond their parents' hardships. Jewish neighborhoods buzzed with new energy. Yiddish newspapers, theaters, labor unions, and schools. Out of the ashes of pogroms, a new chapter of Jewish life began. At the same time, persecution and displacement gave rise to a powerful new idea, Zionism. For centuries, Jews had prayed for a return to Zion, the biblical homeland. But in the modern age, this longing took on political form. In the 1890s, Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist, argued that Jews could never truly be safe in diaspora. Assimilation had not stopped hatred, emancipation had not silenced anti-Semitism, and pogroms showed how vulnerable Jews remained. Herzl's vision was clear. Only a sovereign Jewish state, in their ancestral land of Palestine, could secure their survival. Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, bringing together delegates from across Europe to discuss the dream of return. They adopted the goal of establishing a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. Though small at first, the movement gained momentum, especially among young Jews disillusioned with life in the Pale. Zionism offered not only safety but dignity, a chance to live as a nation rather than a tolerated minority. Migration to Palestine began in waves, known as Aliyot. The first Aliyah, 1882 to 1903, brought Jews from Eastern Europe and Yemen to Ottoman-controlled Palestine, where they founded agricultural settlements. Life was harsh, malaria rampant, and relations with local Arab populations complicated. Yet the dream persisted. Subsequent waves brought more settlers, schools teaching Hebrew, and organizations dedicated to purchasing land. Slowly, the foundations of a new society were being laid. Not all Jews embraced Zionism. Many in Western Europe preferred assimilation, believing they could find acceptance in their host countries. Others turned to socialism or revolutionary politics, seeing class struggle rather than nationalism as the path to liberation. Still others clung to religious tradition, waiting for a messianic redemption rather than a political one. The diversity of responses reflected the diversity of Jewish life itself, fractured by geography, ideology, and experience. But pogroms and persecution gave Zionism urgency. Each attack in the Pale, each trial like the Dreyfus affair in France, reinforced Herzl's argument. Jews could never rely on the goodwill of others. They needed their own land, their own government, their own protection. In Basel, Herzl famously wrote in his diary, "At Basel I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered with universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50, everyone will know it." His words would prove prophetic. The turn of the century was thus a time of both despair and new hope for Jews. In Eastern Europe, persecution reached brutal peaks, pushing millions to flee. In America, new immigrant communities struggled and flourished. In Palestine, pioneers broke soil and dreamed of sovereignty. And in Europe's salons and congresses, Zionism took root as an idea whose time was approaching. Persecution had once again reshaped Jewish history. The pogroms of the Russian Empire were intended to terrorize and destroy, but instead they dispersed Jews into new lands, spreading their culture and strengthening their resolve. Out of suffering emerged resilience. Out of exile emerged vision. The story of Jewish survival was moving toward its next chapter, one that would bring both catastrophe and rebirth in the 20th century. Part 12: The Holocaust. Catastrophe in the 20th century. The 20th century began with both promise and peril for the Jewish people. Across Europe and America, Jewish communities were flourishing in business, science, and culture. Many believed that the progress of the Enlightenment and Emancipation would finally secure their place in modern society. But beneath the surface, old hatreds persisted, now reshaped by nationalism and racial ideology. Out of these poisonous currents arose the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history, the Holocaust, or Shoah, in which 6 million Jews were systematically murdered between 1939 and 1945. The seeds of destruction were sown in Germany after World War I. The country, defeated and humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, faced economic collapse and political chaos. In this climate of resentment, Jews became scapegoats. Nationalist movements spread the lie that Jews had betrayed Germany during the war, the so-called stab-in-the-back myth. They were blamed for communism, capitalism, and every ill of modernity. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933, these prejudices were elevated into state policy. The Nazis introduced anti-Semitism not merely as prejudice but as the foundation of their worldview. To them, Jews were not simply a religious minority but a racial enemy, an existential threat to the German nation. Nazi propaganda portrayed Jews as parasites, conspirators, and subhuman beings. Laws quickly followed. Jews were stripped of citizenship, barred from professions, and excluded from schools. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 institutionalized racial discrimination, forbidding marriage between Jews and non-Jews and defining Jewish identity by ancestry, not faith. Persecution escalated step by step. Jewish businesses were boycotted, synagogues vandalized, communities humiliated. The turning point came on November 9th to 10th, 1938, during Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Across Germany and Austria, Nazi-organized mobs destroyed synagogues, looted Jewish shops, and sent thousands to concentration camps. The shattered glass of storefronts littering the streets was a grim symbol of the shattering of Jewish life in Central Europe. When World War II began in 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, millions of Jews suddenly fell under Nazi control. In occupied Poland, Jews were forced into overcrowded ghettos, such as the infamous Warsaw Ghetto, where starvation, disease, and violence claimed countless lives. Families were torn from homes, crammed into tiny quarters, and cut off from the outside world. Smuggling food became an act of survival. Resistance took the form of clandestine schools, secret prayer gatherings, and underground newspapers, fragile defiance in the face of despair. The Nazi plan soon escalated from oppression to extermination. In 1941, as Germany invaded the Soviet Union, mobile killing squads known as Einsatzgruppen followed the army, rounding up Jewish communities and executing them in mass shootings. Entire towns were wiped out, with victims forced to dig their own graves. Places like Babylonian near Kiev became symbols of this brutality, where tens of thousands were murdered in a matter of days. From mass shootings, the Nazis moved to industrialized genocide. The final solution, formalized at the 1C Conference in 1942, set out the plan to annihilate the Jews of Europe. Extermination camps were built: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, where millions were transported by train. Families were separated upon arrival, most sent immediately to gas chambers disguised as showers. Their bodies were burned in crematoria. The scale was staggering. At Auschwitz alone, over 1 million Jews were murdered. Life in the camps was a descent into hell. Prisoners deemed fit for work endured forced labor, starvation, disease, and brutal treatment. Children, the elderly, and the weak were killed on arrival. Yet even here, amidst unimaginable suffering, sparks of resistance survived. Prisoners smuggled notes, documented atrocities, and in rare moments even revolted, as at Sobibor in 1943. In the Warsaw Ghetto, Jewish fighters staged an uprising, holding off German troops for weeks with little more than homemade weapons. Their struggle became a symbol of dignity against overwhelming odds. By 1945, when Allied forces liberated the camps, 6 million Jews had been murdered, 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. Communities that had thrived for centuries in Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Germany were gone. Entire cultures, languages, and traditions were wiped out. The Holocaust was not only the destruction of lives but the destruction of worlds. For survivors, liberation did not end the suffering. Many had lost entire families. Displaced persons camps across Europe filled with Jews who had nowhere to return. Homes had been seized, villages destroyed, neighbors complicit. Some survivors emigrated to the United States, Canada, or South America. Others joined the growing movement to build a homeland in Palestine, seeing it as the only answer to a world that had abandoned them. The Holocaust stands as the darkest chapter in the long history of Jewish persecution. It combines centuries of prejudice, religious, economic, social, with the modern machinery of bureaucracy, technology, and ideology. It showed the terrible power of hatred when harnessed by a totalitarian state. And it left wounds that remain to this day, in families, in memory, and in the conscience of humanity. For Jews, the Holocaust became both trauma and warning. It was the culmination of centuries of exile, scapegoating, and violence, from medieval pogroms to modern anti-Semitism. But it also reinforced the determination never to be defenseless again. Out of the ashes of the Shoah, Jewish communities rebuilt, and the dream of Zion became reality in the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. The Holocaust was not an interruption of history but a part of its long pattern, the ultimate expression of a hatred that had followed the Jews since antiquity. Yet, as with every persecution before, survival continued. Against unimaginable odds, Jews endured. Memory became a duty, remembrance a form of resistance. Never again became not only a slogan but a vow, to honor the dead, to guard against forgetting, and to protect the future. Part 13. A Homeland Reborn, the State of Israel. When World War II ended in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. For the Jewish people, the devastation was beyond measure. 6 million had been murdered in the Holocaust. Communities that had thrived for centuries were erased. Yiddish, once the vibrant language of Eastern European Jewry, echoed only in the voices of scattered survivors. Families were shattered, cultural centers destroyed, memories scarred. The Shoah had revealed the vulnerability of Jews in diaspora more brutally than any persecution before. For many survivors, one conclusion was clear: they could no longer rely on the goodwill of others. They needed a homeland of their own. The idea of return to Zion was not new. For centuries, Jews had prayed facing Jerusalem, repeating the words, "Next year in Jerusalem." The modern Zionist movement, born in the late 19th century, had already established settlements in Ottoman Palestine. But the Holocaust gave the dream urgency and moral force. The survivors of Europe needed refuge. The Jewish refugees crowded into displaced persons camps could not simply return to lands that had betrayed them. Many turned their eyes to Palestine, then under British control. The years after the war were marked by struggle. Britain, which had governed Palestine since the end of World War I, restricted Jewish immigration under pressure from Arab opposition. Ships carrying Holocaust survivors were turned back or detained in camps in Cyprus. The image of desperate refugees, emaciated men and women who had survived the camps, only to be denied entry to the land they saw as their hope, stirred outrage among Jews worldwide. Underground organizations such as the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi organized resistance, sometimes clashing violently with British authorities. International opinion shifted. The horrors of the Holocaust made the Jewish claim for a homeland compelling. At the same time, tensions between Jews and Arabs in Palestine escalated, as both communities laid claim to the land. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan, dividing Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan reluctantly. The Arab leadership rejected it outright. Violence broke out almost immediately. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. For Jews around the world, it was a moment of triumph, a homeland reborn after 2,000 years of exile. Survivors danced in the streets, tears of joy flowing freely. The words "the Jewish state" became reality, no longer only a dream whispered in exile. But independence came at once with war. Within hours, neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded. The conflict was brutal. Israel's fledgling army, made up of recent immigrants and Holocaust survivors, fought desperately for survival. Against overwhelming odds, they not only defended their state but expanded its borders beyond the UN partition lines. By 1949, armistice agreements were signed, and Israel stood victorious. But the war left deep wounds. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were expelled, becoming refugees in surrounding Arab countries. The conflict over land, identity, and sovereignty would define the Middle East for generations to come. The early years of Israel were marked by hardship and determination. Waves of immigration poured in, Holocaust survivors from Europe, Jews fleeing persecution in Arab countries, communities from Yemen, Iraq, and Morocco. Camps of tents and shacks sprang up as the young state struggled to house and feed new arrivals. Poverty was widespread, but the sense of renewal was strong. For Jews expelled from Arab lands or driven from Europe, Israel became a place of dignity, a land where they could live openly as Jews without fear. The challenges were immense. Israel faced constant security threats from hostile neighbors, shortages of resources, and political divisions among its leaders. Yet the state built institutions, universities, farms, and industries. The revival of Hebrew as a spoken language united immigrants from dozens of countries. The kibbutz movement experimented with communal living and agriculture. Cities like Tel Aviv grew rapidly, embodying the energy of a society determined to survive and thrive. Persecution, however, had not vanished. For Jews in Arab countries, the creation of Israel sparked retaliation. Pogroms, expulsions, and discrimination forced nearly 1 million Jews to flee from lands where they had lived for centuries. Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus, once vibrant centers of Jewish life, lost their Jewish populations almost overnight. These refugees arrived in Israel with little more than the clothes on their backs, swelling the young state's population and reinforcing its role as a refuge for the persecuted. For the Jewish world, Israel was more than a political entity. It was a symbol of survival. After the Shoah, when 6 million had been murdered, the establishment of a Jewish state was seen as history's answer. A people who had faced annihilation had returned to life. In the collective memory of Jews, Israel became proof that persecution would no longer have the final word. The phrase "never again" found concrete form in a nation capable of defending itself. Still, the birth of Israel also created new cycles of conflict. The Palestinian refugee crisis, the wars of 1956, 1967, and 1973, and decades of violence left lasting scars. For Jews, the dream of safety was realized, but at the cost of entering a region where hostility and war became part of daily reality. For Palestinians, the creation of Israel was remembered as the Nakba, or catastrophe, a trauma that shaped their own identity. Thus, the rebirth of a homeland was at once a moment of triumph and the beginning of new struggles. The founding of Israel stands as one of the great turning points in Jewish history. It marked the end of 2 millennia without sovereignty, the rebirth of a language and a culture in its ancestral land, and the transformation of Jews from a persecuted minority into a people with a nation-state. At the same time, it introduced new complexities, new conflicts, and new questions about identity, justice, and coexistence. For Jews everywhere, Israel became a focal point of identity. Some saw it as the culmination of ancient prayers and prophecies, others as a political necessity born of modern persecution. Whether celebrated or debated, Israel was impossible to ignore. It was, and remains, the most dramatic response to centuries of exile, expulsion, and persecution, the return of a people to their homeland. Part 14. Jewish Life in the Modern Diaspora. When the Second World War ended, the Jewish world had been shattered. Entire communities in Eastern Europe were gone. Ancient centers of Jewish culture in Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine had been annihilated in the Holocaust. Of the millions who survived, many found themselves alone, families destroyed, homes taken, and centuries-old towns reduced to ash. The weight of trauma was almost unbearable. Yet even in this devastation, Jewish life continued. The diaspora, which had endured for nearly 2 millennia, entered a new era, smaller in numbers, but determined to rebuild. The United States became the largest center of Jewish life after the war. Before the Holocaust, America had already received millions of immigrants fleeing pogroms and poverty in Eastern Europe. By 1945, those communities were well established in cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, and Los Angeles. After the Shoah, survivors joined them, bringing memories of ghettos and camps into neighborhoods already filled with Yiddish newspapers, synagogues, and community organizations. The Lower East Side, once crowded with immigrants, gave way to new suburban communities, but the energy of Jewish culture persisted. In America, Jews found not only safety but opportunity. The contributions of Jews to American life grew rapidly in the post-war decades. In the arts, sciences, business, and politics, Jewish figures became central. Hollywood, long influenced by Jewish studio founders, blossomed into the global center of film. Jewish writers such as Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, and Bernard Malamud shaped modern literature. Scientists like Jonas Salk, who developed the polio vaccine, and later Nobel laureates across disciplines, highlighted the intellectual contributions of Jews to the modern world. At the same time, anti-Semitism remained present, if less openly violent. In the United States, Jews still faced quotas at universities, exclusion from country clubs, and subtle discrimination in hiring. Conspiracy theories persisted, though without the state-sponsored brutality seen in Europe. Over time, many barriers eroded, particularly during the Civil Rights era, when Jews often stood alongside African Americans in the struggle for equality. In Europe, the picture was more complex. Western European countries like France and the United Kingdom saw Jewish communities rebuild, though smaller than before the war. Survivors returned to Paris and London, re-establishing synagogues and schools. But Eastern Europe, once the heartland of Jewish life, was nearly empty. Communist regimes allowed little space for religious or cultural revival. Many Jews who remained in Poland, Hungary, and the Soviet Union lived in silence, their traditions suppressed, their memories hidden. For decades, Jewish life behind the Iron Curtain was stifled, emerging only later with the fall of communism. In Latin America, Jewish communities thrived in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, built by earlier waves of immigration. Buenos Aires became home to one of the largest Jewish populations in the world, with vibrant schools, theaters, and synagogues. Yet even there, anti-Semitism occasionally flared, often tied to political instability. Later, in the 1990s, Jewish institutions in Argentina would be targeted by terrorist bombings, a grim reminder that diaspora life could never be entirely free from danger. The Middle East saw the most dramatic shift. Ancient Jewish communities in Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, and other Arab lands, which had existed for millennia, were uprooted after the creation of Israel in 1948. Facing persecution, violence, and expulsion, nearly 1 million Jews fled or were forced to leave, many settling in Israel, others in Europe or America. The synagogues of Baghdad and Aleppo, once filled with life, stood empty. The diaspora map, long spread across the Middle East, contracted sharply. Despite all this upheaval, diaspora communities found ways to preserve identity. Schools taught Hebrew and history, organizations provided mutual aid, holidays like Passover and Yom Kippur reinforced continuity. Survivors of the Shoah became living witnesses, telling their stories in synagogues, schools, and eventually museums dedicated to remembrance. Memory became a cornerstone of modern Jewish life, shaping not only identity but also the commitment to justice and vigilance against hatred. The diaspora also produced diversity. Some Jews embraced religious revival, strengthening Orthodox communities. Others embraced secular culture, blending Jewish identity with broader national life. Movements such as Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist Judaism adapted traditions to modern realities, ensuring that Judaism remained relevant in new contexts. In America, synagogues became not only places of worship but centers of community, culture, and activism. Yet anti-Semitism did not disappear. In the Soviet Union, Jews faced systemic discrimination, barred from certain jobs and persecuted for religious practice. The term refugenik arose to describe those denied permission to emigrate, trapped between oppression and longing for freedom. In the Arab world, state propaganda often portrayed Jews as enemies, conflating Jewish identity with political conflict over Israel. In Europe, far-right movements and conspiracy theories occasionally revived old hatreds, showing that prejudice was never far from the surface. For Jews in the modern diaspora, the experience was one of contradiction. Unprecedented success and acceptance in some lands, continued vulnerability in others. In the United States, Jews reached positions of influence unthinkable a century earlier. In the Soviet Union, they lived under repression. In Latin America, they built thriving communities but faced occasional attacks. The global map of Jewish life was more scattered than ever, yet bound together by shared memory, shared trauma, and shared hope. Above all, the modern diaspora carried forward the ancient rhythm of Jewish history. From Babylon to Spain, from Poland to New York, Jews had always rebuilt after catastrophe. The post-Holocaust diaspora was no different. Though the heart of European Jewry was gone, Jewish life blossomed anew in other lands. It adapted once more, proving again the resilience of a people who had endured exile after exile. By the end of the 20th century, Jews lived in dozens of countries, speaking dozens of languages, practicing in diverse ways. Yet whether in Los Angeles or Buenos Aires, London or Johannesburg, they remembered Jerusalem, the Shoah, and the long story of persecution and survival. The diaspora was no longer only exile, it was a global web of communities, each unique, yet linked by history. Part 15. Continuity and Identity Today. The Jewish story, stretching back more than 3,000 years, has always been shaped by two intertwined forces: persecution and survival. From Egypt to Babylon, from Spain to Eastern Europe, Jews endured expulsion, discrimination, and violence. And yet, against every attempt to erase them, they rebuilt, carrying memory, tradition, and resilience across generations. Today, in the 21st century, the Jewish people live in a world profoundly different from that of their ancestors. Yet the same themes remain: continuity, adaptation, and the balance between vulnerability and strength. The State of Israel stands at the center of modern Jewish life. Since its founding in 1948, it has grown from a fragile state of immigrants to a thriving, complex nation of more than 9 million people, the majority Jewish. It has developed one of the world's most advanced economies, leading in technology, medicine, and agriculture. Its cities, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, pulse with energy, blending ancient roots with modern innovation. Hebrew, once nearly a language of prayer alone, is now spoken in classrooms, offices, and cafes. Israel represents the fulfillment of centuries of longing, the tangible proof that Jewish sovereignty is possible again. Yet Israel's existence is also bound to conflict. Wars with neighboring Arab states, decades of tension with Palestinians, and cycles of violence have defined much of its history. For Israelis, the memory of the Holocaust and the long record of persecution mean that security is never taken for granted. Military service is a reality for nearly every family. Political divisions run deep, both within Israel and in the broader Jewish world, over how best to balance security, justice, and identity. The dream of a homeland fulfilled has also brought new dilemmas about coexistence, democracy, and the responsibilities of power. Beyond Israel, the diaspora remains vast and diverse. The largest Jewish community outside Israel lives in the United States, numbering over 5 million. American Jews have become deeply woven into the fabric of society, shaping culture, politics, science, and the arts. From Hollywood to Silicon Valley, from universities to government, their influence is significant. At the same time, they navigate questions of assimilation, identity, and continuity. How to remain distinctly Jewish in a pluralistic society. How to preserve traditions in families that are increasingly intermarried. These debates echo through synagogues, community centers, and households across the country. In Europe, Jewish communities are smaller, scarred by the Holocaust, but still vital. France has one of the largest populations, with vibrant cultural life, though recent decades have seen an increase in anti-Semitic incidents, from desecrated cemeteries to violent attacks. In Britain, Germany, and Eastern Europe, Jews continue to rebuild, but always under the shadow of memory. In Russia and Ukraine, political upheaval and war have once again placed Jewish life under strain, forcing some to emigrate. In Latin America, Jewish life persists in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, with schools, synagogues, and cultural institutions keeping traditions alive. Yet political instability and occasional violence remind communities of their fragility. In the Middle East, outside Israel, ancient Jewish communities have nearly disappeared. Baghdad, once home to one of the world's oldest Jewish centers, is now almost empty. In Iran, a small Jewish community remains, but under restrictions. The long Middle Eastern diaspora, rooted in antiquity, has largely migrated elsewhere. Globally, Jews today face a paradox. On one hand, they enjoy unprecedented security and success. In the United States and Israel, they live in freedom unimaginable to earlier generations. On the other hand, anti-Semitism has not vanished. In Europe, far-right movements sometimes revive old conspiracy theories. On social media, hatred spreads with new speed. Violent attacks in Pittsburgh, Paris, and elsewhere show that even in democratic societies, Jews remain targets. Old myths, control of finance, global conspiracies, have been recycled in modern forms, demonstrating that prejudice adapts as quickly as Jews themselves have had to. For many Jews, the central challenge today is not survival but continuity. In the diaspora, assimilation and intermarriage raise questions about how future generations will remain connected. Some embrace religious revival, strengthening Orthodox communities that grow rapidly. Others focus on cultural identity, Jewish literature, film, humor, and food as a way of keeping connection alive. Still others build their Jewishness around memory, especially the remembrance of the Holocaust. Museums, memorials, and education programs ensure that the Shoah remains central, both as a warning and as a commitment to resilience. Technology has also transformed Jewish life. Services stream online, Hebrew lessons reach across continents, and global connections are maintained instantly. Communities once isolated now share traditions with one another. The diaspora is no longer only scattered, it is digitally interconnected, giving new meaning to the idea of a global Jewish people. Through it all, the themes remain constant. Persecution is never forgotten, for it shaped Jewish identity across millennia. Resilience is celebrated, for it explains why Jews survived when so many others vanished. Memory is honored, because it binds together communities spread across continents. And hope endures, in the prayers for peace in Israel, in the voices of children learning Hebrew songs, in the stories of grandparents who remember both ghettos and rebirth. The Jewish people today stand at once vulnerable and strong. Vulnerable, because anti-Semitism continues in old and new forms. Strong, because never before in history have they had both a sovereign homeland and thriving diaspora communities. The long story of exile, ghetto, and persecution has not ended, but it has been reshaped. Jews now live not only as survivors but as active participants in modern life, contributing to science, culture, and global society at the highest levels. The journey from Abraham's wanderings to the Holocaust, from Babylonian exile to the rebirth of Israel, is one of the most remarkable in human history. It is a story of a people repeatedly threatened with extinction, yet refusing to disappear. Today, in Tel Aviv and New York, in Paris and Buenos Aires, in synagogues and homes across the world, Jews continue to live that story, carrying forward traditions, remembering the past, and facing the future with resilience. The cycle of persecution and survival has shaped them, but it has not defined them entirely. What endures is identity, faith, culture, and the determination to exist. In the 21st century, the Jewish people remain what they have always been, a people of memory, a people of resilience, and a people whose story, against every attempt to silence it, continues.